Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're finally going to be continuing with our series, The Good, the Bad, and Philosophy. In this video we're going to be looking at, is cultural appropriation immoral? From the perspective of consequentialism. Now, to review, the first half of the series looked at the three top normative theories of ethics: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. If you haven't watched that series, I would highly recommend that you do that now, or if you don't have a basic understanding of kind of a introduction to ethics class. In this part of the series, we are applying these theories to modern ethical questions to see what answers they will give. We're trying to do a little bit of applied ethics. The question we're examining today is whether or not cultural appropriation is moral by the standards of consequentialism. In the last video, we looked at deontology. It was very much on the long side, so we're going to try to make this one a little bit shorter. I don't know if we're going to succeed. So we're only going to be looking at 3 consequentialist positions instead of, I think we did 5 for deontology or something like that, which should offer a range of different options, though some of them may end up giving similar answers to a lot of the questions. But we'll take a look. Specifically, we're going to be looking at classical utilitarianism, desire consequentialism, so everything from classical utilitarianism but using desire instead of pleasure, and intended consequentialism. Once again, taking everything from classical utilitarianism but changing it to intent instead of actual. Alright, if you don't know what those mean, check out the series on consequentialism, or the part of the earlier part of this series on consequentialism. So, with that, let's get going. So we had 7 examples from the first video in this part of the series on cultural appropriation, and we're going to look into each of those examples. As I've said before, we're not going to be trying to define specifically what cultural appropriation is in this series, but rather look at examples which have been claimed by some people to be cultural appropriation, and look at the morality of those particular examples based on these different theories. So the purpose of this is in part to answer the question, are these situations moral? Are they immoral? What should you do in them? But also in part to answer the question, how do these theories stand up to actual issues in the world and answering actual real ethical questions instead of just kind of rough philosophical questions. So with that, let's take a look at Halloween. Someone from a culture in power goes to a Halloween party dressed in a traditional outfit of another disempowered culture. Is this action morally acceptable or impermissible? If you are in a culture of power and you dress in a traditional dress of someone from a culture out of power for Halloween, are you doing something wrong? So this, to me, is one of the quintessential examples of cultural appropriation that's often touted out there, and so I think it's one of the important ones to address when we're talking about this. So, classical utilitarianism asks one simple question for all of these. Does your action maximize pleasure? If you were in a situation where someone at the party would feel pain from seeing you wear that costume, and everyone else could get just as much pleasure from you wearing a different costume, you should not do it. If, however, no one at the party would feel pain from you wearing the costume, or your pleasure wearing it would exceed any pain caused, then it's acceptable. And you couldn't get that same pleasure from wearing a different costume. This is interesting since it feels a bit like a relativistic answer, that your actions are acceptable so long as they're taken in a culture which is okay with those actions. Basically, you could do something that might be considered broadly offensive, so long as you're doing it within a group of people that doesn't consider that offensive. Some people might take this as a plus of the theory, some people might take it as a detraction, but that's where this theory is going to stand. However, since the only harm here can be found in the impact that your costume has on someone, if there's no one that's harmed, it's acceptable. As with many consequentialist theories, if there's not a victim or a party that's in some way harmed, and there are people that are benefiting from it, then you're probably in the good. What about desire consequentialism? In this case, you don't need to show that harm is done, but rather that desires are unfulfilled. This runs into an interesting problem of scope that we're going to discuss a little bit here and then kind of push to the side for the rest of the video. So, might be a great many people who desire for traditional outfits of oppressed cultures to never be used for Halloween costumes. But should they be given standing if they're not present at a particular party or event where it's done? Now, this might be a more general question that you have for desire consequentialism. Whose desires count? If I have desires about people that I never interact with, or never would even know if those desires went fulfilled or unfulfilled, should my desires count in their ethical calculations? If we do give these people standing, this might easily be classified as immoral, since while some people may have the strong opinion that it's immoral to do that or desire that it's not done, few people actively desire that it's done. That you are wearing costumes of oppressed people to Halloween. There might be a lot of people that desire that you have the right to do that, but I think fewer people would desire that you actively do that. But I'm worried about giving these people standing because it seems like it's going to put such an epistemic burden on anyone ever making a choice. Because in order to decide whether to make a particular choice, you need to analyze the desires of the entire world and see where the majority of people fall. That seems like a high burden to put on anyone ever making a choice. So for now, we're only going to give standing to people that directly interact with the choice, since it seems drastically impractical to be ethically required to consider the desires of everyone in the world when making any ethically relevant choice. So just those desires of the people who might realize that their desire went fulfilled or unfulfilled. Now, if you're in a situation where maybe you're posting on social media and a wide range of people are going to be seeing that and having those desires fulfilled and unfulfilled, this expanse of who has standing, or this scope of this issue, is going to expand drastically, even with that caveat. But barring those kind of internet postings and connection to more people, where the only people you're interacting with are the people at this party, then I think we can limit the scope to just their desires being fulfilled or unfulfilled, because other people don't realize if their desires are fulfilled or not. But that also might be a problem that you just have for desire consequentialism. With that said, if more people at the party desire that you not wear the costume than desire that you do, this would be immoral. Note here that your goal is to maximize fulfilled desires and minimize unfulfilled desires. So if you could fulfill more desires by wearing a different costume, you should. So if there's one person, two people at the party that desire you not wear the costume, you desire that you wear the costume, and everyone else doesn't care, you should wear a different costume. As long as that other costume, no one would desire that you not wear it. But if no one at the party has a desire for you not to wear the costume, and you have the desire to wear it, you're morally justified in doing it. As before, this depends greatly on the preferences of those at the party. However, here, unlike the classical utilitarian position, you don't need to show harm. Just that enough people have an unfulfilled desire to make the action immoral. So you don't need to show that someone is actually harmed by you wearing a costume that might be considered offensive. You just need to show that their desires for you not to wear that costume are not met. So hopefully, desire consequentialism and classic utilitarianism are going to feel really similar in a lot of these examples, but there's some parts where we're going to try to pick them apart so you can get a better understanding of how these two different ethical theories deal with these problems and issues. All right, now, intended consequentialism. Intended consequentialism, if your intent is to cause harm or make fun of the culture, even if no one was actually harmed or offended by your costume, your action is immoral. This is a much epistemically generally easier to judge one from the first-person perspective. I know what my intent was, then I know whether I caused harm or not. As a skeptic, I don't know if I even know my own intent, so that might be a problem, but for anyone that thinks they can know those things, this is a much easier epistemic burden to meet. However, if your intent was to simply have a good time and make others happy, then your action was moral, even if you ended up doing real harm by wearing it. While this might not sit well with you, remember that it will disallow someone with the intent to harm, even if they fail to cause harm, where the other positions would encourage such a person, so long as you don't cause any actual harm, no matter how malicious their intent. So what's important to note here is how intended consequentialism versus classic utilitarianism deal with a couple situations differently. So let's take an example that's a little bit stronger than this, and say someone does something that is clearly racist and clearly would be offensive to people of a culture out of power were they to hear it at a party. Now, and let's say that person does so in one situation at a party where there's a bunch of other people that are just as racist and no one is actively harmed by it. In that situation, our first two, the desire consequentialism and classical utilitarianism, will say that's fine. Even if that person's intent by saying that racist joke or doing that thing is to cause harm. Whereas the intent consequentialism will say, just because you happen to be at a place where there were no people from that minority culture doesn't mean you get off scot-free. Your intent was bad, so you're in trouble. It's immoral. Now take the opposite situation. Let's say someone does something that is just as racist or problematic, but does it unintentionally, does it by accident, does it because they don't know any better, and does it just with the intent to make people have a good time and not with the intent to harm or oppress anyone, but does it at a party where there are people that are actually harmed and offended by that. The first two will say that's problematic, that's a moral issue, because you actually harmed people. Whereas intent consequentialism is going to say your intent is what matters. If your intent was to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, you're fine. Both of those are interestingly difficult situations, but hopefully that's described a little bit of the discrepancy of how each of these positions will handle them. So if your intuition is that what matters is your intent, and if someone in a party full of people that wouldn't be offended by it still has the intent to harm people, that they're morally culpable, you might lean more towards intent consequentialism. Whereas if your concern is more with the actual impact, regardless of your intent, and you say, I don't care if you didn't know any better, you still caused harm, and so it's wrong, then you're going to fall more in line with the classic utilitarianism. I think either one has its drawbacks. But once again, we're trying to get a sense of these positions, and we're trying to analyze these positions based on how they deal with real situations. And this is an example of how they differ based on real situations. All right. Whew. Broadly, so long as no one is harmed, they don't want you not to do it, and you didn't mean to harm them, wearing such a costume would be acceptable. So if no one's actually harmed, there's no one that desires you don't do it, that you're interacting with, and you didn't mean to harm them, the costume would be acceptable. However, if you meant to harm people or go against their wishes and you succeeded, all three of these positions would mark it as immoral. So that's kind of the extent of that. There's going to be some gray area in the middle, but on either of those ends, it's going to be moral or immoral. The difficulty here is that unless someone tells you that a particular costume makes them uncomfortable, you wouldn't know. So you may not know whether a particular action is right or wrong, even after doing it. If you're concerned about this, you might lean towards intent consequentialism. If you think that actions should be right or wrong, even if before you take them, you may not know their impact, you might lean towards desire consequentialism or utilitarianism. So if you're concerned about your epistemic ability to determine if you're acting morally correct, you might lean towards the intent consequentialism side of things. But if you're not as concerned about that and you think that actions can be morally right or wrong, regardless of how much knowledge you have of them, and you may never know if something you did was right or wrong, then you might lead towards the desire consequentialism or utilitarianism. Whew, we got to speed up. This is going to be a long video again. All right. The next example, someone from a culture of power wears an outfit associated with another culture simply because they like the style. When we started this series, there was an example of this where a white woman wore a traditionally Chinese dress to prom. Not as a costume, but because she liked the style of the dress. The question here is it right to wear an outfit from a culture which has less power than your own just because you like the style? Now, it's interesting to note that between consequentialism and deontology felt that these two examples were importantly different. Consequentialism is going to be a little bit less so. As before, classical utilitarianism is going to judge this based on whether you have maximized pleasure. So this will once again depend on your context. If people around you are happy to see you wearing the outfit, then you should do it. If people around you are unhappy to see you wearing it, you should not. In the previous case, a white woman living in China wearing that dress would probably be maximizing happiness if many saw that as their fashion choices spreading to cultures outside of China. As in this particular case, the reaction to this woman posting this thing online was that people who were in China said, wow, that's cool that our culture is spreading to other places, whereas Chinese Americans in America said, ooh, that's problematic, that's part of our culture, you shouldn't do that. So it's going to depend on your context. If you're doing that in a place where people find it acceptable, it's okay. If you're doing it in a place where people find it unacceptable, it's not. Once again, the issue of social media, where, once again, the whole world is your scope or has standing, becomes much more difficult to analyze a lot of these ethical choices. So if she wore that in an American context where wearing it would cause pain due to people finding it offensive, she'd be in the wrong. Since this specific case deals with social media, the scope does become difficult, since we may need to total up the sum total of pleasure and pain from everyone that saw the post to really assess its impact and morality. Whew. Social media makes a lot of these questions difficult because your impact becomes suddenly so broad, and it's a lot harder to aggregate people down to an average. Our desire case will work in much the same way. If people around you desire you to wear particular clothes, you should, even if that goes against your desires. Whew. This is a little bit concerning, since it seems to have a bit of that flavor of cultural relativism again. And if you're concerned about cultural relativism, you might be concerned with this position. We might have the intuition that someone should be able to wear something even if others desire that they act differently. You might say that a woman should be able to wear something other than a burqa, even if she lives near some people who desire that she act that way, or lives near many people that desire that she act that way. We might say that you have a right to do certain things, even if it doesn't fulfill the desires of those around you. If you live in a very conservative religious area, you may still have the right to wear certain things regardless of the number of unfulfilled desires that happen around you, that your desires have some kind of special privilege. If you have these kinds of concerns, you may have an issue with desire utilitarianism or desire consequentialism. However, this doesn't necessarily apply to utilitarianism because we have to show actual harm. So if people are actually getting pain from seeing you wear a costume that they don't like or an outfit that they don't like, then there's a problem. But showing that there actually exists that pain is probably going to be difficult. Finally, in terms of intent consequentialism, in this case, so long as you're not wearing an outfit with the intent of diminishing or making fun of a culture, it's acceptable, regardless of the actual impact. Similarly, if you wear something with the purpose of doing more harm than good, you're doing something wrong, even if you fail at doing harm. In this case, the woman with the dress could be considered fully moral, since she did not mean to do harm, but rather maximize good by just wearing a nice-looking dress. Overall, you may be unsatisfied with the utilitarian and the desire consequentialist answers if you think we should be able to wear things even when they offend the sensibilities or desires of others. And once again, that for the utilitarian, that's going to depend on where you draw that line in terms of pain. Do people actually experience pain by seeing you wear an outfit that offends them? I don't know. These theories can't quite get at the idea that a particular group might have a certain claim on a particular style, or differentiate that position from the claim that you should be required to fit your wardrobe to the preferences of others regardless of culture. The intent version is more permissible, but still doesn't really separate these cases. Both of these things don't deal with that idea that a particular culture could have ownership over a particular style or particular set of fashion. Now, you might think that's a bug, or you might think that's a feature. You might think that actually particular cultures shouldn't have ownership over particular styles, and so it's not wrong for someone to be doing that so long as they don't offend or harm anyone. While the deontologist is going to say something along the lines of, well, we might be concerned about a certain level of ownership or a certain level of rights regarding that culture there. However, you might think that's a bug, you might think it's a problem if you say that we really do need to outline a way in which people own a particular culture or own a particular style of fashion. All right? Let's keep going. So, mascots are a lovely and defensive symbol here for the whole video. So, next we look at sports mascots, particular mascots from cultures out of power being used by cultures in power. This can range from the Washington Redskins mascot, which uses a derogatory slur in its name. It's not just using a particular culture of people as the mascot, but in fact using a derogatory slur for that people as the name of the team, to the Florida State Seminoles, which is actually supported by the Seminole tribe. There are two questions here. If you're a team owner, is it moral to name your team after a culture with less power? And if you're a fan, is it moral to support a team which has such a mascot? So, lots to talk about here. It seems that a team owner might temporarily reduce pleasure of fans by changing a team name. But if the name is considered offensive, will reduce long-term harm. The harm to fans will diminish over time as fans get used to the new name, but the harmful effects of keeping an offensive name will continue as long as that name is in place. Therefore, it seems that changing the name is a moral choice, since in the long run it's going to maximize happiness, so long as it is doing some kind of perpetual, constant harm. Now you might make the argument that, well, while the Redskins mascot is doing some consistent, perpetual harm because it's offensive, it uses a slur, all these things, you might say that the Seminoles, maybe they're not doing as much harm. Maybe that's something that's actually maybe doing good because the people that are impacted by it say, yes, this is something we want, or we get pleasure from this. We don't experience pain by seeing this. So in that way, you could definitely split out and separate the problem of using a derogatory slur that causes pain versus using a name of a particular tribe that actually causes pleasure to people. So in that case, you could distinguish those. But here a lot of the question is going to be, does the long-term eventual pleasure outweigh the immediate pain or problems that might be caused by changing? For the fan, you'd need to weigh the temporary harm done to that fan from switching to a different team, with the ability of the fan to change the owner's mind a tiny fraction by reducing revenues. I'd argue again that since the costs are very short-term while the benefits are long-term, even if you are only a small part of changing someone's mind, if you think that the team owner should change the name, you're probably committed to the claim that the fans should not support the team either, since they can have a marginal impact on the team owner's choice. If every single fan decided to leave the team owner would probably change the name. Therefore, you can have that marginal impact by changing it yourself. The short-term pain of, oh, look, I have to get a new wardrobe, isn't that big. But you might hold a different view in terms of how you're counting up pain and pleasure here. You might say that changing teams, you might lose a lot of friends, and you might have some serious long-term harm because you don't spend as much time with people that are positive influences in your life and give you a lot of pleasure to spend time around them. You might say that the pleasure outweighs the pain. So I think for this one, this is really going to depend on the person and the fan. If you get a lot of deep-seated pleasure from it and you don't think you can change the team owner's mind by moving away, you may be justified. But if you think that working with enough people and moving enough people away would actually change their mind, and you don't get that much pleasure from spending time with friends and you think you would have those same friends even if you were rooting for another team, you probably are morally obligated to change. Desires are going to be less sensitive to long-term concerns since preferences change, and it's unclear how having one preference go unfulfilled for a long time ranks against two preferences being quickly fulfilled. So what we're going to focus on is just trying to maximize preference fulfillment now. But once again, and this is why I really love this series so much, is we're able to see some of the issues with some of these theories. So a big problem for our desire consequentialists is going to be comparing desires now to desires 5 years in the future. If I have a particular desire now and a different desire at some point in the future, am I justified in taking actions based on my desire now, or do I have to also factor in future desires that I may have? It's an interesting question. We're going to focus on maximizing preference fulfillment right now to make this simpler and to give it a little bit of that difference from the classic utilitarian model. In this case, the team owner should change the team name if more people desire a change than desire it to remain the same. If the team has a large fan base that likes the name and a small number of detractors, then the owner is completely justified in keeping the name. If the opposite is the case, then the team owner should change the name of the team. So, excuse me. In this situation, because the name of the team is really something that is global and affects everyone, we do actually have to factor in anyone that has an opinion on this's desires. Because, well, you wearing one costume or another to a party, most people won't know if that desire gets fulfilled or unfulfilled. In this situation, most people are aware, who care about this, are aware whether or not the team mascot's name has changed. So you do have to factor in all those desires. And as a good consequentialist, you just do the simple math of the calculus of summing up all the desires on one side, all the desires on the other side, and say, does one outweigh the other? For the fan, the question has a much less global scope. If the people around you desire you to stop rooting for the team, you should. If they don't, you shouldn't. Since in the short term you can't really affect the owner's decision, the fan's decision is not going to have the same marginal effects on the global conversation as did in the classic utilitarian example. In terms of intent consequentialism, this seems pretty straightforward. Someone that supports the Redskins or the Seminoles because they are deeply racist and wants to do harm and demean Native Americans is immoral, regardless of whether or not they succeed. Conversely, someone that supports a team without the intent to do harm, but just the intent to enjoy football and maximize their own happiness is blameless. Similarly, for an owner, someone that keeps the name simply because they think that's the way that will maximize the most happiness. They think that there's more fans that would be harmed by changing the team name than people that are actively harmed by the name itself, is fine because that's their intent, is to maximize happiness. Whereas if they're keeping the name because they're deeply racist and they want to keep people down, regardless of the actual impact of the name, then they're in the wrong. As before, the morality of these claims will depend on the perceptions of the teams and how much harm is actually being done. This allows for the names to have been moral in a previous time when more people agreed with the representations, but immoral now when people have more of a problem with them. Now, this is a particularly interesting phenomenon that the morality of a particular action can change over time. If, once again, it can be a bug or it can be a feature. If you're in the camp that believes that we should say that, you know what, people in the past, it was a different culture, it was a different time, their actions should be judged on the morality of that time or the amount of pleasure people would get from them taking those actions in that time, you might say that, you know what, this is a good theory because it's saying that because the amount of pleasure people get has lessened over time and the amount of pain people get has increased, we need to actually switch the morality of that particular action. However, you might also say that it's a bug. You might say that we should be able to critique people in history that did things that we thought were wrong, even if they were in the moment having the most pleasure and the least pain for people of that time. You might be concerned that the intent consequentialist gives the ignorant a pass, but the response to that would be that it's too high a burden to sum up all the benefits and costs of a particular mascot to hold us to moral choices based on everyone's opinions. So once again, this gets to this dichotomy of the epistemic question of should we hold people to account for knowing and understanding the opinions of literally everyone in the world? Or should we allow people that are ignorant of particular opinions and feelings to get off scot-free, morally speaking? Whew, let's keep going. Next up, we've got whitewashing. The next subject is whitewashing in film. This is where characters which were portrayed originally in other media as individuals of color or historic figures of color are portrayed by white actors. The question here, excuse me, is for directors, writers, and producers. Is it moral to depict someone that was historically of a culture out of power as someone from a culture in power? The response of the consequentialist is often used by producers to justify this practice. Basically, the claim is that people don't want to see non-white actors in movies. desire consequentialism, or that people don't enjoy seeing non-white actors as much, or really that people won't go to see non-white actors. However, it's quite possible that this claim is factually untrue, in which case the argument for doing this is grossly unsound. But even if you accept this claim, the consequentialist might argue that there is a greater desire to see other experiences portrayed on screen, or marginal utility gained from children seeing people like them as actors, which outweighs the benefits that someone that's already overrepresented on screen gets from seeing one more person that looks like them. So even if you agree with and accept the claim that the majority of people would rather see someone from the culture in power than someone from the culture out of power on the screen, you can say that the amount of pleasure that those people get from seeing one more person like them on the screen compared to the amount of pleasure that the smaller group of people, the minority out of power, gets from seeing even one person like them in a leading role on the screen, it doesn't match up. And we at least have an obligation to put some people from those cultures on the screen in those situations because of that. Unfortunately, these questions are empirical and we can't really answer them here. I wouldn't be surprised if in this day and age a strong consequentialist case could be made against whitewashing from either a desire or utilitarian viewpoint, either by disputing the first claim that that's not actually how people's desires work, that people are more than willing to see people that don't look like them on the screen and are more happy to get to the truth of the historical figure or the truth of the originally displayed media, or by arguing that there's more marginal utility gained by putting one character from a culture out of power on screen than is lost by the majority who already has a lot of representation of losing one person. So I think for either of those reasons, there's a good case to be made from the desire utilitarian viewpoint that whitewashing is immoral. As before, intent consequentialism is going to be more permitting, though. This will allow whitewashing as long as the producer is sincere in their claim that their goal was simply to create the movie that would make the most people happy. If their goal was in fact to disenfranchise and hurt out-of-power communities, then and only then would their action be immoral. Even if you agree with the conclusions of these positions now, it might be a little uncomfortable that these positions could have been used in the past to justify discriminatory practices. If that's the case, you may feel that consequentialism as a whole does not sufficiently address these issues, and you might want to sprinkle some deontology or virtue ethics in your theory as well. Though, that said, those theories each have their own problems. Check out the previous video on deontology and how they deal with all of these issues, and we'll do a future video, one day, another long video like this, on virtue ethics and how virtue ethics would tackle all of these issues. Next up, food. So in our fifth scenario, 5 of 7, wow, I try to make these videos short, but there's just so many things to get through. We'll examine restaurants. The fifth scenario we will examine has to do with restaurants. Sometimes I get too excited and I start reading and then go off on a tangent and then try to start reading again and it doesn't make sense. Whew! Restaurants are often themed around particular types of foods, of out-of-power ethnic foods, or groups of ethnic foods, or fusions between various ethnic foods. Sometimes the chefs and or owners of these restaurants are not of some or any of the ethnic groups from which their recipes are drawn, but rather an ethnic group with more power. Since most customers do not know who the chef or the owner of a particular restaurant is, we will look at the choice of the head chef or owner to start or cook at a restaurant which serves food from a culture which has less power than their own. As with deontology, classical utilitarianism will depend on the quality of food produced, to a certain degree. If someone is able to make authentic food from a particular ethnic group and the customers are unaware of who's doing the cooking, it seems that happiness is maximized. Even if the cook puts someone that is actually from that culture out of business, so long as the customers are at least as happy with the food, the happiness of the new cook balances out the pain of the cook that went out of business, regardless of their ethnicity. As we saw before, utilitarianism and consequentialism aren't going to give special rights or ownership to a particular individual or group. Only if the food is actually bad, but the cook is able to put the better and more authentic restaurant out of business, just because of privilege or systemic issues, we might consider this immoral, since customers are actually getting a worse meal. Their pleasure is being reduced by a restaurant that's worse at making food coming in and putting out of business a restaurant that's better at making food, regardless of the ethnicity of the cooks or the owners. In terms of desire, we might run into more issues. If someone walks into a restaurant and has the desire to eat food cooked by someone from that culture, or to support a business that's owned by someone of that culture, their desire will go unfulfilled in a restaurant where the cook is not from that culture, even if they enjoy the food just as much. In this case, the morality of the action will depend on how many people have this specific desire in a particular population. If many people have this desire, it's likely immoral. If few or none do, it may be moral. Or if rather the desire they have is to eat authentic food as opposed to eat food cooked by someone from that culture. So it's really going to depend on exactly what that desire looked like. Why did they walk into that restaurant? Did they walk into that restaurant to eat authentic food from a particular culture, or because they want to support a business owned by someone from that culture? In one case, their desire goes fulfilled, and it's fine. In the other case, their desire is unfulfilled, and we'd have some moral issues with it. With intent consequentialism, if your goal is to cook low-quality food which is not representative of the culture, you may be in moral hot water, whether or not you succeed. However, so long as your intent is to make people enjoy and eat good food, you're in the clear from this moral perspective. This situation pulls apart the desire and utilitarian perspectives a bit. Since you can have an unfulfilled desire, you're not aware of chefs are more morally culpable under this framework than under classical utilitarianism, since all that would matter in the latter case is the quality of the food. If you think that desire fulfillment matters more even when you're unaware of it, then desire consequentialism might seem more appealing. If you think that what really matters is your actual experience of enjoying the food, you may be more convinced by the classical utilitarianism perspective. There's an interesting, weird case here that I'll cover for just a second. You might also be concerned that someone might cook inauthentic but tasty food. This will probably satisfy the utilitarian because your pleasure is still going to be maximized. So let's say you have a particular culture that their food, when cooked authentically, is just okay. But then someone from another culture comes and cooks that food, doesn't do it quite authentically, but actually makes it better and improves upon it. The utilitarian is going to say, well, you're maximizing pleasure because more people are happy with that food than the actual authentic food. But the desire consequentialist is going to say, if those people desired to eat authentic food, regardless of their desire about supporting an owner from that culture or eating food cooked by someone from that culture, if their desire was to eat authentic food, even if you made better food, that desire might go unfulfilled, and then it would be immoral. So I think this is a really good example for really pulling apart our classic utilitarianism and desire consequentialism. All right, on to music. So we'll look at a similar, though slightly different issue regarding music. Frequently, performers from a culture with more power will perform in a style created by a culture with less power. Due to their greater power and a larger portion of their audience resembling them, they often receive more recognition and money for similar work. The question here is whether it is moral for these artists to produce work which uses styles that individuals from cultures of less power have created when they may get more money and recognition for it. So, as we've seen before, consequentialism and utilitarianism don't deal with kind of these property rights or ownership almost at all, really. So, we're going to have some different answers than we might see from deontology. So utilitarianism will likely endorse actions like this, in fact, encourage them, since creating more music only increases happiness. It does not matter that that happiness is accruing predominantly to individuals of one group or another. They don't, to use an economics term, they don't care about distribution. If the alternative is that fewer people create music, so there's less happiness, then the utilitarian will actually say that people that have the ability to create music that makes people happy have a duty to do so regardless of their genre or their ethnicity. If one musician has a larger potential audience than another, it's actually better for them to be creating, since it will create more happiness. So the utilitarian is going to say maximize happiness no matter what you do. So if we can add another person creating in this genre, regardless of their ethnicity, and that'll increase people's happiness because they'll have more music to listen to and more people will have access to this music, then it's better to do, even if that person makes more money than someone from the ethnicity that created that style of music who is trying to produce in it. In terms of desire consequentialism, for this to be immoral, the desire of people to see only people of a certain ethnicity producing certain types of music would have to be greater than the desires of individuals to hear larger varieties of music and wider ranges of artists producing in that genre. While this might empirically be the case, I'm skeptical that there are so many people who are kind of isolationists in terms of music. I don't think there's that many people out there that are deeply offended by people from different ethnicities trying out or producing different music. I think that generally within the music community, it's seen that the reason that we are able to have such a broad range of musical styles is exactly because we have intermixing between different ethnic groups or different original cultural styles. So I'm skeptical that there are so many isolations out there. It's possible, though. And if that is the case, that there's a lot of people that desire that you of this ethnicity should only produce music within your genre, then it might be morally impermissible. But I'd argue this position is generally going to be permissible. Finally, in terms of intent, so long as someone's creating music for the express purpose of overshadowing someone from an ethnic group where that style of music originated, as long as you're not creating music with the express purpose of overshadowing someone from an ethnic group where that style of music originated, this will be acceptable. If that harmful intent is there, however, this will be unacceptable regardless of whether the music actually maximizes happiness. Broadly, consequentialism is not concerned as much with distribution of happiness or desire fulfillment. If one person can make more people happy than another, the first person is right to do so in place of the second, regardless of race or ethnicity, or ownership of the particular style or means of making people happy. If you're uncomfortable with this, consequentialism may not be for you. Our final topic is going to be writing. Often writers choose to tell stories from viewpoints that are not their own. This can exist across many dimensions of diversity. Here we're going to focus just on those authors that choose to write from the perspective of a different culture. Specifically, we're asking, is it moral to write from a character with a different cultural perspective than your own? Particularly if you're from a culture of power and the character you're writing from is a culture out of power. As with food, the morality of this from a utilitarian point is going to hinge on the ability of the author to accurately portray the viewpoints of another group. If you portray those viewpoints inaccurately, you may cause harm both to that group because they will be frustrated with their own portrayal, but to members outside of that group as you will be misrepresenting that group and giving them false ideas about what that group is. However, if as an author you're able to accurately portray experience in a way that maximizes happiness, it seems that you're acting ethically. There's an implicit implication in here that you would be maximizing happiness by giving true portrayals of people. So someone might say, well, maybe actually portraying people inauthentically would make people happier. I'm going to say that while you might get a little bit of short-term extra happiness from that, in the long term, giving people false representations of other cultures is going to cause more harm than good. But if someone has a specific example that they think can butt against that, they might say, actually, we can parse that apart in terms of being truthful with your writing is distinct from giving happiness with your writing. But give me an example in the comments below. With desires, we may run into some of the same issues as with food. If someone has the desire to understand the perspective of a particular group from someone that is within that group, their desire may go unfulfilled if they read a book from someone outside that group, even if it represents that viewpoint correctly. Whether people have such a very specific desire is an open question. But even if they do not, it seems that people have the desire to understand other viewpoints, even when they're not written by someone of that group. So it seems that accurate portrayal of an experience is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for this to be a moral action. So whether or not people have the desire to be reading books that actually are from people from that perspective, which I think there are some people that have that desire. How many of them may be a question. What matters more, definitely, is whether or not the portrayal is accurate. If we think that your audience is mostly people that don't care about the specific author, but care about the accurateness of that portrayal, then we're going to say that this is immoral. If, though, we think that there are actually a vast majority of people that care more deeply about who the actual author is, that only want to read books that are written by people from that culture to understand that cultural point, this may be immoral here. And finally, intent consequentialism will set what may seem like a lower bar in some ways, but maybe a higher bar in others. Even if you fail at accurately portraying a particular experience, you'll be considered ethical if your intent was to accurately portray that experience. However, if your intent was to do harm, even if you portray a particular experience accurately, you're going to be ethically culpable. As with the food example, our non-intent examples focus on your success in accurately portraying a particular experience. Perhaps we could imagine some situation where an inaccurate portrayal might lead to more overall happiness and therefore separate the desire framework from the utilitarian framework, but I'm really skeptical that such an example exists in the way that we had with food of someone making a better tasting meal that was actually inauthentic. I don't think that works for people's experiences as much, for the reasons I offered before. Whew, what do you think? That was a long video, but we're under the time that we had for the deontology video. Hopefully the virtue ethics one will be 15 minutes shorter even. Do you agree with how I said that the positions would treat each situation? Whew, clearly, after writing this video, I'm bad at using words. Did any of these treatments make you more or less interested or aligned with a particular position? Because as much as we're assessing the question of whether or not cultural appropriation is moral from a consequentialist perspective, we're also assessing the question, how do these consequentialist perspectives deal with actual applied ethical situations? So did these assessments of these positions lead you to say, oh, maybe desire consequentialism isn't specific enough for me, or maybe intent consequentialism actually is a little too permissive for my intuition? Give me those answers in the comments below. This is a touchy subject. Please try to stick to philosophical arguments and avoid ad hominem insults in the comments. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Thanks for sticking with me for this big long one, and stay skeptical, everybody.